Welcome to the Tech Humanist Show, a multimedia format program exploring how data and technology shape the human experience. I'm your host, Kate O'Neill.
And I like technologists who understand that as much as they're building sometimes amazing things and, helping people or, making, really creative stuff, there's real potential for harm in a lot of contemporary tech. And we need to be self-critical about it. We need to put on our critical thinking hats or non-hats or whatever you call it, and recognize that not everything we're going to make is going to be great for humanity as a whole.
That was Greg Epstein, Humanist Chaplain at Harvard and MIT, and New York Times best-selling author. In this episode of the Tech Humanist Show, we examine the intersection of humanism, technology, and ethics with Greg, exploring his new book, Tech Agnostic: How Technology Became the World's Most Powerful Religion and Why It Desperately Needs a Reformation, and discussing how humanist values can guide us in an increasingly tech-driven world. All right, Greg, your new book, Tech Agnostic, first of all, is fantastic. I just admitted to you before we started recording that I haven't finished reading it, but I've skimmed it and I've, of course, read the sections that I'm in. I think it's fantastic. What has it been like for you to elaborate on this concept of tech as a modern religion? How's that been received, and how's that going so far?
It's been fascinating. I've spent 5-6 years working to this point, and now here I am talking about tech agnostic. The idea that technology has become the world's most powerful religion, and that it desperately needs a reformation. I'm definitely hearing, people want to try to push back and say, well, yeah, but is it really a religion? Is this just a metaphor? And I say, the answer is yes, it's both, right? And
yeah,
it's fun to sort of take apart whatever challenges there might be to the thesis, because the point I would say is, if the tech world wants to not be labeled as a religion, it should stop behaving so religiously.
How does it compare, though? How does a tech religion compare to traditional belief systems or traditional religions? What would the potential overlaps or differences be?
Yeah, I mean, so the way that the book is structured, and you have a sense of this because you're in there, there's 3 sections, and you're a key figure in the last of the 3 sections. So the first section is religious beliefs, essentially. I mean, there are theological beliefs of the tech religion, or what I would call the tech religion, that really closely mirror what traditional religions are most known for. And these are sort of mainstream ideals within mainstream tech. The second is religious practices. I'm a humanist chaplain. I'm a non-religious clergy person. And I've always said that religion is much more than just belief. It's also very much about things that you do. It's about behavior. And so there are all these behaviors that we practice as we're working with contemporary tech that are very religious. And then finally, the third section of the book, and I think I spend at least a third, if not more like close to half of the book, talking about the sort of positive alternative to the aspects of tech that are sort of more like conservative religion, really, is what I'm arguing. It's not just that they're like any religion. I don't have a problem with all religion. But the positive alternative, and you, Kate, as a tech humanist, your work is really close to my heart as the positive alternative to the more fundamentalist aspects of tech, because I'm a humanist. I've always tried to build a positive alternative to the aspects of religion that I disbelieve in. And I think what you're doing in tech is you're building a kind of tech culture that is a positive alternative to the most, let's say, dogmatic aspects of contemporary tech.
Well, I very much appreciate that. Is it also what you call for a reformation in the title of in the subtitle of the book,
Mm-hmm.
and in the discussion and the discourse you unpack? Is that what you're referring to when you say, why it desperately needs a reformation? Is it this positive alternative that you're discussing?
Yeah, that's it. The idea is, again, I'm not anti-religious and I'm not anti-tech. I've always been, I tried to make myself known for being the person who is, doesn't happen to be traditionally religious. You can call me an atheist, you can call me an agnostic if you really want to get philosophical about it. I prefer the word humanist because it speaks to who I am and what I do believe in, not just what I'm not. But the idea is I prefer religions and humanist traditions as well that know how to be self-critical. I like Christians that know how to recognize that Christianity ain't perfect and it has done harm, even though obviously it has done good, and they may be very deep believers, and I respect that. I like Jews that know how to critique Judaism, that know that the state of Israel isn't perfect, and they'll talk to you about that. I like Buddhists that know that Buddhism isn't perfect because it sort of gets marketed as such in modern day Western society, Muslims, etc. And I like technologists who understand that as much as they're building sometimes amazing things and helping people or making really creative stuff, there's real potential for harm in a lot of contemporary tech, and we need to be self-critical about it. We need to put on our critical thinking hats or non-hats or whatever you call it, and recognize that not everything we're going to make is going to be great for humanity as a whole. So that's the reformation to me, and that's what I see, somebody like yourself as part of.
Well, I appreciate you including me in that, and I do feel like it's a really important touchstone of the way I approach my work. But I also want to understand if it is one and the same with when you look around at like the ethical AI movement or the responsible tech movement and all of these different kind of approaches. In fact, yesterday, I wish I had it saved in my LinkedIn. Someone had posted that everyone's sort of shying away from the word ethics in so much as like ethics washing. They're using responsible, or they're using, sustainable, or they're using like all these sort of synonyms and different terminology and different taxonomizing of what the activity needs to be. But first of all, nobody's calling it a reformation except for you. So good for you. You're unique in that way.
Well, I mean, it's, think about it though. It's not, I'm using that metaphor, right? Like the Reformation, and I do even take a little time at the beginning of the broader section of the book that you're in, the Reformation section, for which you're the second chapter, the humanists. But I take a little section of that and I even look at Luther's life because he was an interesting figure, right? But I'm not saying that we need to do the Protestant Reformation over again. I mean, that
literally
would be, yeah, right. There's all these things that if you take them to their their most extreme end, then it would be sort of comedy. And there's a bit of comedy in the book. It's meant to be an entertaining read, no doubt. But I grew up in Reform Judaism, for example, which was a Jewish communal tradition that had emerged starting in the 19th century, where Jews recognized, the practices that our people have been doing for the last 1,500 years are not working in modern society, at least not fully. And what can we do to bring our tradition into the modern world so that it's consistent with our ideals as modern people? And, there's all sorts of political traditions of reform too. I mean, where would we be politically without reform? So That's really what I'm calling for. It just happens to be a nice religious metaphor as well. But, the point is that we've been bombarded with such a wave of new tech, what Anangir Dardas called new shit when he and I were talking for TechCrunch at the sort of beginning of the process of writing this book for me. And there's just this, this wave of new shit washes over us. And, when you're covered in new shit, it's very difficult to sort of look down at the muck and recognize like, oh, which parts of this would I like to wash off? And, is there anything that I want to keep? I'm not saying it's all shit in that sense, but I am saying, we're covered and we don't know sometimes what's worthwhile and what isn't.
Let's start with the covered aspect, though. I think it's an interesting. If we can go back to the notion of the behavior discussion in this, because I think what's so interesting about this idea of tech as belief to me is when you say that the process or the components of tech as religion include this component of behavior. I think about, this phrase that I use in my keynotes and in my work a lot is that machines are what we encode of ourselves. And we think about whether we encode our biases and our values, which of course we do both of those things. But we need to be thinking about as encoding the best of ourselves, our most enlightened ideas, our most egalitarian viewpoints, our most evolved understandings of the world. But that isn't typically how that's approached in terms of, like thinking about gamification elements in apps or in systems. It's not how we are necessarily optimizing for, the most views or the most return visits or things like that. Yeah. Is there a way that you, in the research of this book and the thinking about it, did you find a relationship between the way that people can think about developing technology and bringing the most useful and constructive new shit to the world, and that aligns with thinking about behavior in this belief context in a way that's helpful, that's useful, that brings us to a better place?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I mean, I always really appreciate that this is something that you're deeply concerned with, and I'll say this. This is one of the areas where I really think that the sort of religion comparison can work and be helpful. Because here, what we're talking about is a mindset shift. It's, creating technology that is better for humanity as a whole is slower. It's in many cases less astronomically profitable, at least at first. It is, it's a different paradigm. And the way that I think we get there is by shifting our mindset, by recognizing self-critically, I've become so caught up in moving fast and breaking things that there's something maybe in myself that feels a little bit broken by all of this. I talk to students at Harvard and MIT who are not okay, who are so worried and stressed about keeping up with the pace of innovation, of keeping up with all of the work. How are they going to get to the point where they're perfectly successful in the way that this culture sort of teaches them that they need to be? And it's way, way too much. And so what I'm suggesting is that, it's very difficult to regulate that. And we're not anytime soon going to be either blessed or cursed or both with a revolution of economic systems where capitalism is going to seed the way to some sort of humanism. And so how does this take shape? It's that a lot of people would have to have a mindset shift where they would recognize, oh, actually, if I stop trying to dominate everyone and everything, and if I stop trying to either create or use tech in a way that makes me the big winner, and leaves everybody else out, then maybe not only will the world be better, but I will actually feel a greater sense of fulfillment, a greater sense of meaning, a greater sense of connectedness, with other human beings. And these are incredibly valuable, actually priceless things that could lead to overall a better life for me, a better career for me, because I'll be part of a bigger whole. Like, that's the point, is that this actually, even though I'm a non-religious person, it has to be viewed as and I hesitate to say this word, but as a kind of spiritual transition, into a different phase of tech, rather than just, a capitalistic transition.
Well, it sounds like the sense in which you're using the word spiritual or invoking that idea is less about, the way we might traditionally think of spirituality, and more about this sense of thinking ahead, of
Yeah.
thinking ahead to some connected state, or some sort of society in which we are even more connected and even more driven by the data and technology than we are today, which I know is hard for many people to fathom, but of course is the direction in which we are headed. I see that as being part of the work that I do. I think of as being about future readiness, and that feels like it aligns with that. Does future readiness align with the direction of this book? Like, are we thinking about the future in this discussion?
Absolutely. And the thing is that there's a lot of different ways to think about the future. And I think future readiness, I'm not familiar with all the literature on it, but I think, it sounds about right to me, in the sense that, in the book, I talk about a lot of the more dogmatic approaches to the future that you see in tech. There's a lot of capital P prophecy in the tech world that I explore, where people are, prominent people like Mark Andreessen, people like Sam Altman, people like Nick Bostrom, people who tend to look like me, honestly, will be prominently telling you exactly what's going to happen in the long-term future. So if people are curious, they haven't read elsewhere, what I'm getting at in the sort of first sections of the book, where I'm claiming that tech has a kind of theology, it's like this idea, that Nick Bostrom writes about, for example, in a famous paper called Astronomical Waste, where he says that there is going to be a future millions of years from now, if not longer from now, where there will be trillions of digital beings, AI beings with consciousness and soul, that have been uploaded into clouds that are powered by distant stars. And if that's not enough, he also says that if we fail to do everything that we possibly can to bring that about right now, if we fail to sacrifice ourselves and what we might think of as reasonable and rational now to bring that about, then we, in fact, are a kind of mass murderers. And Mark Andreessen echoes that absolutely in his Techno-Optimist Manifesto, literally saying that it's mass murder, quote, mass murder, unquote, if we don't bring about the AI with trillions and trillions of dollars of investment right away. And so, that's one vision of the future.
Right.
But then there's sort of like the indigenous principle of 7 generations ahead, that in indigenous communities, there's a long-standing tradition of saying, leave the world better for 7 generations ahead of you. Now, that's not trillions of AI souls uploaded into a cloud, Kate, but it is a future readiness. And so that's what I'm talking about, can we talk about the future without having to get into extreme dogma that's very self-gratifying for those of us who have the chance to participate in, hugely profitable tech, but it's not necessarily good for most everyday humans.
Yeah, it's such a great distinction, and it's one that I get into in my book coming out in January. What Matters Next is I explore the the space around accelerationism and that whole techno-utopian idea, and how much the emphasis in Nick Bostrom and Mark Andreessen and everyone you talked about, how much their emphasis is on the future lives, the future people to whom we have such a responsibility, when in equal reality, and maybe even more pressing, urgent reality, we have an obligation to people who are alive here and now on this planet, who aren't being served as well, who don't have the resources and the means that others do. So there is this ethical balance that I try to strike in that book, and it seems like, going back to something you were talking about earlier in this discussion of justice and equality, and making sure that people have resources, that reminded me of the discussion I had with Yanis Varoufakis on this program, the interview about oh gosh, I just blanked on the name of his book, Techno-Feudalism. And you said that, we don't expect capitalism to cede over to a humanistic model or anything like that. But what he ultimately calls for is greater democracy. And it feels like that's kind of what you're saying too, in a sense, like greater democracy in a sense.
Yes, for which technologies can be tools, right? That the point is that, the famous example of us treating technology as not just a tool, but treating ourselves as the tool to assist the technology, is, the idea that we all, a billion plus of us just went down the rabbit hole with Facebook. And then we woke up, after maybe Cambridge Analytica and such, realizing, hey, we're the product for this company, right? How does it make gazillions of dollars? It sells ads. So we're not purchasing anything. We're the product. And I think we've created an awful lot of tech. It's not even just that company that I've just mentioned is one of the largest companies in human history. It's also representative of a much broader phenomenon, even than that. And, even if you looked at Meta itself, it's probably as big as the Catholic Church, if not way bigger, right? And, and then think about how many other companies there are that are like that, where we're the product now. And so, that's the kind of reform I'm talking about. I'm very excited for your new book, Kate. I use two of your books, fairly extensively in Tech Agnostic. Of course, Tech Humanist becomes a kind of symbol, and I've got a picture of you in that Humanist chapter, giving a Tech Humanist lecture. But then I talk a little bit about your book, Surviving Death, which is an incredibly heartbreaking, poignant, hopeful book, as a way of making the point that how we get there, how do we get there? People would rightfully say, right? How we get there is taking the kind of approach to life that you take in Surviving Death, where you're deeply, deeply human. You're brave to be vulnerable, and you are accepting of your own and others' limitations, and you're willing to be public about that. And it's beautiful. And that's an example of how we get to a better future, how we get prepared for that future.
I really appreciate you calling that out, and I genuinely deeply appreciate how well you treat the topic within the book. It's so meaningful to me to see it explored, to see my work explored in this context. But I also wonder, when we think about that, one of the things that you allude to with Surviving Death is, the limitations, my dealing with the limitations of people, including myself, right? Like, you talk in the book about my struggle to sort of ask for and accept help in this context of, this great tragedy. That feels like a clue in a larger sense, right? Like, what does it mean to ultimately, in going through this tragedy that's discussed in the book, I found that community was a really big part of what the upshot was. I found that it meant so much to already be part of community when tragedy struck, so that, people could be part of my life and part of the process.
Yeah.
And it deepened my connection to community in various ways, right? Like the people often say in the wake of death or tragedy that it's not necessarily the people you expect to show up who do, and some of the people that do show up are or that you expect to show up don't, and so on. But as we take that over back into thinking about tech and going forward with digital communities and so on, what can we learn, do you think, from that approach? How do we build more resilient communities? How do we think about what we're doing with connecting with so many people online, with utilizing these semi-public spaces, these private public spaces online to foster community? What have you learned in this process that has to do with and you talk about all tech is human and the sort of congregation of that.
Yeah.
Is it about building these types of all tech is human like communities that are built around an ideal? Is it around, does it have to be in person? Do we see opportunity for building the sort of community that people get from religion in other ways that tech can enable?
Well, I'll tell you what I don't know, and then I'll tell you hopefully what I do know about where all of this heads, right? Because I try to be very careful in this whole process of writing the book, not to paint myself as any kind of prophet. I don't know the future. I'm agnostic. I mean, that's the point, right? That sure. I truly and genuinely don't know what will happen next. I also don't know for sure in every case, like which technologies are helpful to humanity and which ones aren't, or which ethical organizations are going to actually continue to behave ethically and which ones aren't. And I think there's been, especially as I say, from people who look like me, white, bald male staring back at you, too much braggadocio, too much, sort of techno machismo about follow me. I know the way. I will lead you. I will see all, be all. Right. So no, I don't know all of that stuff. But and I talk about, for example, all tech is human because I'm fascinated by their model, and I think that it's really interesting, and I think that there is a lot of really good potential there. But on the other hand, and as I talk about it, pretty pretty comprehensively, that I don't know if they're fully on board, and if I'm fully on board with them. I think we need to feel it out and see where all that goes. But I will say this, here's the part that I do know. I do know that technologists and tech people, and to a certain extent, we're all tech people now, like we're all immersed so fully in this world, that tech people, we need to work on being more self-critical, on being more willing to reveal our own imperfections and to talk about them, and to accept those same kinds of imperfections, flaws, uncertainties, and losses in others. That we're not trying for human perfection here. There's so much emphasis that gets put into look at me, I've achieved everything. I've become a kind of techno demigod where I'm, my life is the hockey stick graph where, I'm just forever upward with how much greatness I can represent. And, we need to set much of that aside and think, what really feels good about living in this world as a human being is feeling meaningfully connected to others, is feeling that we're not alone, that we love and are loved, and that our lives have meaning because of the interaction between us and others. And it turns out that if you're a huge winner all the time and everybody's so envious of you, that you actually are very unlikely to have those kinds of positive human connections, because you're just trying to defend your spoils of victory all the time, and everybody's coming at you like, I want some of that. In fact, if we can build something more sustainable in tech, where we build tech that gives us individually a good decent living by giving other people a good decent living and allowing us time and energy to focus on being human, we're all going to raise our water level of happiness quite significantly.
Yeah. Well, you said a mouthful. That's a fantastic takeaway. I wonder, as we start to move maybe to closing, what are some thoughts that you might have for folks inside an organization working for a Facebook, for example, or a much smaller company who see that maybe some potential for the organization to move to a more open-minded, a more humanistic sort of approach? I'm also reminded, I should interrupt myself to say, I'm reminded, I was reminded earlier in some of your remarks of many people I have known who have, in a sense, been the would-be reformers of many organizations. They've been the people who have said like, oh, I'm going to join this company that's doing unethical things, and I'm going to try to steer them in a direction that it seems right. And then, of course, that usually
that didn't happen.
Work out very well.
Shock.
But I think that there are people who see more of an opening, and I wonder if you have any insights to share in any of the research you did, any of the thinking that you did in this. What's the best way forward with that? How can people champion these values within the organization they work for?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there's a lot there. In fact, I would say the number one question that I end up discussing with Harvard and MIT students, and even, faculty and staff that come to talk with me as a chaplain, it's not necessarily even that this is the question that they come to me with, like, hey, Greg, I need you to answer this, but it's what we end up talking about anyway, which is, who do I want to be and how do I want to live? Because they know how to be successful. That's clear to a lot of the people who I think are listening right now and who come to my office. They know how to be successful, but they don't necessarily know how to be a person that they will enjoy being, how to be a human being that looks back at them in the mirror and says, no, not just good job professionally, good job as a person. And that's tough for all of us to figure out. But I'll say this for, the people trying to figure out their tech careers and who are resonating with some of these questions that obviously are explored throughout the book from the very beginning, introduction chapter through to the end. So the Reformation section, is divided into a few different parts. There's one part which is, let's honor the apostates, the heretics, the Cassandras among us, the people who are crying out for reform in this big world that I'm labeling as a religion, and who are maybe risking some of their career, risking some of their success, or risking, as Vina Dubal does. She's sort of a star of that chapter 6. She risks some of her peacefulness and even maybe her own safety, right? There are these white vans that are at her literal doorstep, and the way that Susan Fowler and other whistleblowers in tech described to her as a common experience that they had. And there's a point where Vina and I are even wondering, where I'm wondering with Vina, do you think that your brother's death had anything to do with your activism against Uber and Lyft? And, she believes that is not the case, but, maybe her father even suspected for a time similarly to what I did, right? So, I'm not asking anybody to take that level of risk, but I am saying, you probably, if you're listening to this, have a great skill set where, you could get another job if you are willing to speak out and it doesn't go the way that you'd hoped in your current company. So consider that, courage is a major factor in how, healthy of a relationship you have with yourself and others. See if there's a way that you can be brave, like some of the people whose stories I'm able to tell there are incredibly brave. The second piece is, like Kate and others, consider being a tech humanist, somebody who builds the alternative, somebody who, again, is your product going to scale massively right away? Are you going to be, touched by the invisible hand of the market, an incredibly religious symbol, by the way,
Yes.
in a sort of magical way, if you build positive alternatives to dogmatic tech? I don't know. But, you might find community and you might find an awful lot of supporters because you're not alone in wanting a more humane tech. And there's lots of stories about that in the book. And then the third is get involved in kind of a congregational form of this, whether it's All Tech is Human or any other number of community organizations trying to be more responsible and ethical. But finally, the last piece of it, Kate, is, again, it's this mindset shift of agnosticism. That is something that anybody and everybody can do without making a big outward gesture. We are in a world right now where if Donald Trump is elected next week, or even if he just comes dangerously, perilously, terrifyingly close, as most people would suggest that he's going to come, it's probably because he sounds really confident when he speaks. And a lot of his voters, especially white male voters of a certain, background, really, they're afraid. They're actually afraid. We are afraid. And we gravitate towards something that sounds strong and certain. And in that world where that could potentially lead us down the path to disaster, there's this real beauty to adopting an agnostic mindset, a mindset that says, not only do I not know, but I, as a writer, Leslie Hazelton, that I quote in the end of the book, says, I take a spirited delight in not knowing. Because not knowing and admitting that I don't know affirms my humanity and it affirms yours. And so we may not know, but we're going to not know together. And what we are going to know is that we care about one another and we care about creating technology that affirms one another, even if it's not the most profitable thing.
I think that's a brilliant note to end on. I want to thank you so much for coming and talking this through with our listeners, with me. Everybody know that they should go and pick up a copy of this book right here, Tech Agnostic. Greg, where can people find you and out about more about you and your work and what you're thinking?
Just first of all, get the book, Tech Agnostic. I would be really honored. Get it anywhere, wherever you want to buy your books. I'm agnostic on the platform. So you can find it at Penguin Random House or MIT Press, and anywhere you find books. And then, I used to be the Twitter chaplain during the pandemic, but Twitter RIP. I'm working more on LinkedIn these days. I would love to connect with more people on LinkedIn. GregMEpstein.com is also a website.
All right. Well, I hope folks will find you there. Thank you again. I really appreciate this discussion and I appreciate your work, Greg.
It's a pleasure, Kate. I looked forward to this thinking, at some point I'll get to actually talk to you on your podcast, which I listened to researching the book. It's so fun.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Humanist Show. This episode was produced and edited by Thrive Loud Productions, with research by Ashley Robinson and Aaron Daughtry of Interrobang. You can find more information about the show's guests and links to their projects at thetechhumanist.com, where you can also find more episodes, or you can subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Special thanks to all of our guests for lending their voices to help make the future a brighter place. I'm Kate O'Neill. You've been listening to the Tech Humanist Show from KO Insights.